We can now return to our question about Abraham's identity and provenance. What the Bible says in chapters 11 to 25 of Genesis is that Abraham, ultimately descended from Noah, migrated from Ur of the Chaldees, first to Haran, then to various places in Canaan, traveling to Egypt in time of famine, but returning to Canaan and ending his days at Hebron, where he made his first landed purchase. The reference to the Chaldees is anachronistic, since the Chaldeans did not penetrate southern Mesopotamia until towards the end of the second millennium BC, and Abraham is dated much earlier, closer to its beginning. The Chaldeans were inserted to identify Ur to readers of the Bible in the first millennium BC. But there is no reason at all to doubt that Abraham came from Ur, as the Bible states. And this already tells us a lot about him, thanks to the work of Woolley and his successors. To begin with, it associates him with an important city, not the desert. Hegelians like Wellhausen and his school, with their notion of determinist progression from primitive to sophisticated, from desert to city, saw the Hebrews originally as pastoralists of the simplest kind. But the Ur Woolley excavated had a comparatively high level of culture. He found there, in the grave of Meshkel Lamdug, hero of the good land, a superb helmet made in the form of a wig from solid gold, the locks of hair in relief, and a religious standard for religious processions, decorated with shells and lapis lazuli. He found, too, a giant ziggurat, the temple raised on multiple platforms, which, it is fair to conjecture, inspire the story of the Tower of Babel. This was the work of Ur-Nammu of the Third Dynasty, 2060 to 1950 BC, a great lawgiver and builder, who had himself portrayed on a stele, a fragment of which we possess, as a workman carrying a pick, trowel, and measuring dividers. It is likely that Abraham left Ur after the time of this king, and so carried within him to Canaan tales of the ziggurat to heaven as well as the much earlier flood story. When did he make this voyage? Dating the patriarchs is not such a hopeless task as was once supposed. In Genesis, antediluvian datings are, of course, schematic rather than actual, but genealogies are not to be despised, any more than the other early king list of antiquity. The pharaoh list, provided by such sources as Manetho, an Egyptian priest who lived in Hellenistic times, 250 BC, enable us to date Egyptian history with reasonable confidence as far back as the First Dynasty, 3000 BC. Berosus, a Babylonian priest who corresponds roughly to Manetho, gives us a similar king list for Mesopotamia, and archaeology has unearthed others. If we examine the list of ante- and post-diluvian names in Genesis, we find two groups with 10 names on each, though the datings vary as between the near original Hebrew Masoretic text, the Greek Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. These groupings are similar to non-biblical literary records, and the biblical long datings are akin to lives of the Sumerian kings before the flood at Sheropak. The earliest king list gives only 8 antediluvian kings, but Berosus has 10 fitting the Genesis pattern. The link between the two is perhaps Abraham, who brought the tradition with him. It is difficult to anchor the Mesopotamian king list like the Egyptian in absolute time, but the consensus is now to date Sargon and the Old Akkadian period to 2360 to 2180 BC, the lawgiver Ur-Nammu and the third dynasty of Ur to the end of the second millennium or the beginning of the first, the Hammurabi, who is unquestionably an authentic statesman and law codifier, to the precise regnal period of 1728 to 1686 BC. The evidence suggests that the Genesis patriarch narratives belong to the period between Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi, the outside limits being 2100 to 1550 BC, that is, the Middle Bronze Age. They certainly cannot be later, in the Late Bronze Age, because that would date them to the Egyptian Empire of the New Kingdom, and the patriarchal sections make no mention of an Egyptian imperial presence in Canaan. Albright Albright struggled with the problem of Abraham's dating for most of his professional life, pushing him backwards and forwards between the 20th century BC and the 17th, finally concluding that he could not have lived before the 20th or after the 19th. This dating seems reasonable. The ability to give a rough dating to the patriarchs enables us to relate them both to archaeological records and to the various literary archives which have now emerged from Bronze Age Syria and Mesopotamia. These last are important because they enable us not only to confirm, but to explain episodes in the patriarchal stories. The archaeological finds include the investigation by Kathleen Kenyon of roadside tombs outside Jericho, which resemble the cave tomb burials described in Genesis 23 and 35. Verses 19 to 20, and Nelson Glueck's archaeological survey of the Negev, which uncovered many Middle Bronze Age settlements of the patriarchal type. Glueck noted that many of these settlements were destroyed sometime after 1900 BC, which confirms the hints of ravaging we get in Genesis 14. The literary finds are very considerable and suggestive. In 1933, A. Parrott excavated that's A as in his name, A. Parrott, not A. Parrot, excavated the ancient town of Mari, modern Tel Harari, on the Euphrates, 17 miles north of the Syria-Iraq border, and found an archive of 20,000 items. This was followed by the transcription of a similar archive of clay tablets at ancient Nuzi, near Kirkuk, the city of the Hurrians, the Horites of the Bible, who formed part of the kingdom of Mitanni. A third archive of 14,000 tablets was discovered at Ebla, modern Tel Mardikh, in North Syria. These archives cover a large span of time, those at Ebla being somewhat before the time of the patriarchs, those of Nuzi, 16th, 15th century BC, being somewhat after, while the Mari tablets in 19th century BC to mid-18th century coincide closely with the most probable dating. Together, they help us to create a picture of the patriarchal society which illuminates the Bible text. One of the strongest objections to the contention of Wellhausen and others that the early Bible books were compiled and edited to suit the religious beliefs of a much later age has always been that many episodes in them do no such thing. They embody customs which were evidently strange and inexplicable to the later editors of the first millennium BC, who, in their reverence for the text and traditions handed down to them, simply copied them out, without any attempt at rationalization. Some passages remain mysterious to us, but many others are now explicable in the light of the tablets. Thus both the Ebla and the Mari tablets contain administrative and legal documents referring to people with patriarchal type names, such as Abram, Jacob, Leah, Laban, and Ishmael. There are also many suggestive expressions and loan words related to Hebrew. Moreover, these unknown litigants of the early 2nd millennium BC faced exactly the same kind of difficulties arising from childlessness, divorce, inheritance, and birthrights as their biblical namesakes. Abraham's despairing plan to make one of his retainers his heir for lack of his own, and his proposal for the adoption of Eleazar as heir presumptive, reflect closely Nuzi practices. Nuzi also produces exact parallels with Abraham's dealings with his wife Sarah, and his resort to her maid Hagar as a licensed concubine as a result of Sarah's failure to have a child, and indeed of the unhappy domestic consequences which followed. Nuzi marriage contracts indeed specifically provide for these contingencies. One Nuzi tablet attests the sale of birthright by an elder to a younger brother in return for 3 sheep, just as Esau transferred his to Jacob for a mess of pottage. A Nuzi tablet also provides an instance of the binding power of the oral disposition of property in the form of a deathbed blessing, thus illuminating the remarkable scene in Genesis 27, when Jacob and his mother Rebekah conspire to deceive his father, Isaac, and get his dying nomination as heir. Most strikingly of all, perhaps, the Nuzi Archives explains the baffling biblical account of Jacob's relations with Laban, which we now know to have been a common adoption problem. The heirless Laban adopted Jacob as his son, as well as his son-in-law. Then he had sons of his own. A tablet from Nuzi reads, The adoption tablet of Nashwi, son of Ersheni, he adopted Wulu, son of Pohisheni. When Nashwi dies, Wulu shall be heir. Should Nashwi beget a son, he shall divide equally with Wulu. But Nashwi's son shall take Nashwi's gods. But if there be no son of Nashwi, then Wulu shall take Nashwi's gods. And Nashwi has given his daughter, Nuhuya, as wife to Wulu. And if Wulu takes another wife, he forfeits Nashwi's land and buildings. The Nuzi tablets show that family gods were like title deeds with symbolic legal value. We now understand that Rachel stole Laban's teraphim gods to redress what she felt to be an unfair legal provision. The Mari tablets again give examples of the legal ritual of confirming a covenant by slaughtering an animal, just as Abraham confirmed his covenant with God in Genesis 15:9-10. We can thus begin to place Abraham and his descendants in their true historical context. At the end of the 3rd millennium BC, civilized international society was disrupted by incursions from the east. These invaders caused great trouble in Egypt and in settled Asia. Archaeology reveals an absolute break in continuity in towns such as Ugarit, Byblos, Megiddo, Jericho, and Old Gaza. indicating pillage and abandonment. These peoples, moving from Mesopotamia towards the Mediterranean, spoke West Semitic languages, of which Hebrew is one. A particular group is referred to in Mesopotamian tablets and inscriptions by the ideogram SA.GAZ, or as Hapiru. Late Bronze Age Egyptian sources also speak of Ibiru or Habiru. By this term, they were not referring to Bedouin or desert dwellers, who existed then as now, for they had a different term for this category. Habiru seems to have been a term of abuse used of difficult and destructive non-city dwellers who moved from place to place. They were not regular tribes, migrating regularly with the flocks, according to the cycles of the seasons, as they still do today in parts of Asia Minor and Persia. Their culture was superior to most desert tribes, precisely because they were not easy to classify. They puzzled and annoyed the conservative Egyptian authorities, who knew exactly how to deal with genuine nomads. Sometimes they served as mercenaries. Some held jobs as government employees. They worked as servants or as tinkers and peddlers. They were donkey folk who moved in caravan or merchants. Sometimes they acquired considerable wealth in the form of flocks and followers. Then they might endeavor to settle, acquire land, and form petty kingships. Each group of Hebrew had a sheik or war chief, who on occasion could launch an attack with as many as 2,000 followers. When they got the chance to settle and build, their leader called himself a king, and they attached themselves to the great king of the region. Apart from Egypt, a centralized autocracy of immemorial antiquity, even in the 19th century BC, no king was powerful on his own. Hammurabi of Babylon had always 10 or 15 kings in attendance. It was a matter of fine judgment for a regional monarch whether to allow Hebrew kings to settle and become, in effect, feudatories, or to beat them off. The same dilemma confronted petty local kings already settled, who had formed part of an earlier wave of immigrants. Abraham was the leader of one of these immigrant Hebrew groups, a substantial chief with 318 trained servants born in his house. In Genesis 12, we see him dealing with a major authority. Egypt in Genesis 14, he had his men serve as mercenaries with the petty king of Sodom. His relations with settled authorities, large and small, always contain an element of unease and are marked by deceptions, such as his repeated pretense that his wife Sarah is his sister. We now know from the tablets that a wife with the legal status of a sister commanded more protection than an ordinary wife. Pasture was limited. Water was often scarce. If a Hebrew group flourished in settlement, its very wealth became a source of conflict, an almost uncanny adumbration of later Jewish problems in the diaspora. Genesis 13, verses 6 to 11, shows Abraham and his nephew Lot obliged to separate, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. Genesis 21, verses 22 to 31, shows Abraham at Beersheba involved in a dispute over water rights with the men of Abimelech, the local king, a dispute resolved by a covenant sealed by animal sacrifice. Abraham's relations with Abimelech, though sometimes tense and always legalistic, were peaceful. It was sometimes in the interest of the settled kings to tolerate the Hebrew as a source of mercenaries. But if the strangers and sojourners grew too numerous and powerful, the local king had to tell them to move on, or risk being overwhelmed himself. Thus we find Abimelech telling Abraham's son Isaac, "Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we." All this Genesis material dealing with the problems of immigration, of water wells and contracts and birthrights is fascinating because it places the patriarchs so firmly in their historical setting and testifies to the Bible's great antiquity and authenticity. But it is mingled with two other types of material which constitute the real purpose of the Bible narratives: the depiction of individuals, the ancestors of the people, in a moral context, and still more important, the origin and development of their collective relationship with God. The vividness and realism with which the patriarchs and their families are depicted in these ancient tales is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the work and is without parallel in the literature of deep antiquity. There are archetypes of humanity, like Ishmael, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. But no stereotypes. Each character leaps vibrantly from the text. Still more remarkable is the attention devoted to women, the leading role they often play, their vivacity and emotional power. Abraham's wife, Sarah, is the first person in history recorded as laughing, when, as an old woman, she is told she will bear the much-wanted son. She did not believe it, but laughed within herself, saying, "After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being so old also?" Genesis 18:12. Her laughter is bittersweet, sad, ironic, even cynical, a foretaste of so much Jewish laughter through the ages. When the son Isaac was born, however, Sarah said, "God hath made me to laugh, so that all who hear will laugh with me." And her laughter is joyful and triumphant, communicating her delight to us over the distance of 4 millennia. Then there is the story of how Isaac, a gentle and meditative man who loved his mother Sarah, deeply secured a wife to take her place, the shy but kind-hearted and loving Rebekah. And this is the first tale in the Bible to move us. Still more stirring, though not strictly from the time of the patriarchs, is the book of Ruth, describing the affection and devotion between two sorrowing and solitary women, Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth. Their emotions are so tenderly and faithfully conveyed that one instinctively believes that a woman set them down. Certainly, the Song of Deborah, which constitutes chapter 5 of the book of Judges, with its multitude of feminine images and its triumphant vindication of female strength and courage, must be the lyrical work of a woman. Yet it is clear from internal evidence that this was one of the earliest sections of the Bible to be written down, and it seems to have attained more or less its present form not later than 1200 BC. These early Bible records testify to the creative role played by women in the shaping of the Hebrew society, to their intellectual and emotional strength, and to their high seriousness. Yet the early Bible is above all a statement of theology, an account of the direct, often intimate relationship between the leaders of the people and God. Here the role played by Abraham is determinant. The Bible presents him as the immediate ancestor of the Hebrew people and founder of the nation. He is also the supreme example of the good and just man. He is peace-loving, Genesis 13:8-9, though also willing to fight for his principles, and magnanimous in victory, 14:22. Devoted to his family and hospitable to strangers, 18:1. Concerned for the welfare of his fellow men, 18:23. And above all, God-fearing and obedient to divine command, 22:12, 26:5. But he is not a paragon. He is deeply human and realistic personality, sometimes afraid, doubtful, even skeptical, though ultimately always faithful and carrying out God's instructions. If Abraham was the founder of the Hebrew nation, was he also the founder of the Hebrew religion? In Genesis, he appears to inaugurate the special Hebrew relationship with God, who is sole and omnipotent. It is not clear whether he can accurately be called the first monotheist. We can dismiss Wellhausen's Hegelian notions of the Jews, symbolized by Abraham moving out of their primitive desert background. Abraham was a man familiar with cities, complex legal concepts, and religious ideas, which for their day were sophisticated. The great Jewish historian Salo Baron sees him as a proto-monotheist, coming from a center whose flourishing moon cult was becoming a crude form of monotheism. The names of many of his family, Sarah, Micah, Terah, Laban, for example. The names of many of his family, Sarah, Micah, Terah, Laban, for instance, were associated with the moon cult. There is, in the book of Joshua, a cryptic reference to Abraham's idolatrous ancestry. Even Terah, the father of Abraham, served other gods. The book of Isaiah, reproducing an ancient tradition otherwise unrecorded in the Bible, says that God redeemed Abraham. The movements of the Semitic peoples westwards along the arc of the Fertile Crescent is usually presented as a drift under the pressure of economic forces. But it is important to grasp that Abraham's compulsion was religious. He responded to an urge he believed came from a great and all-powerful, ubiquitous God. It is possible to argue that, though the monotheistic concept was not fully developed in his mind, he was a man striving towards it, who left Mesopotamian society precisely because it had reached a spiritual impasse. Abraham may perhaps be most accurately described as a henotheist, a believer in a sole God, attached to a particular people who nonetheless recognize the attachment of other races to their own gods, with the qualification he is the founder of the Hebrew religious culture, since he inaugurates its two salient characteristics, the covenant with God and the donation of the land. The notion of the covenant is an extraordinary idea, with no parallel in the ancient Near East. It is true that Abraham's covenant with God, being personal, has not reached the sophistication of Moses' covenant on behalf of an entire people. But the essentials are already there, a contract of obedience in return for special favor, implying for the first time in history the existence of an ethical God who acts as a kind of benign constitutional monarch, bound by his own righteous agreements. The Genesis account, with its intermittent dialogue between Abraham and God, suggests that Abraham's grasp and acceptance of the monumentous implications of his bargain were gradual, an example of the way in which the will of God is sometimes revealed in progressive stages. The truth was finally brought home to Abraham as described in Genesis 22, when God tests him by commanding him to sacrifice his only son Isaac. This passage is an important milestone in the Bible, as well as being one of the most dramatic and puzzling in the entire history of religion, because it first raises the problem of theosity, God's sense of justice. Many Jews and Christians have found the passage unconscionable, in that Abraham is commanded to do something not only cruel in itself, but contrary to the repudiation of human sacrifice, which is part of the bedrock of Hebrew ethics and all subsequent forms of Judeo-Christian worship. Great Jewish philosophers have struggled to make the story conform to Jewish ethics. Philo argued that it testified to Abraham's detachment from custom or any ruling passion except the love of God, his recognition that we must give God what we value most, confident that God being just, he will not lose it. Maimonides agreed that this was a test case of the extreme limits of the love and fear God rightfully demands. Nachmanides saw it as the first instance of the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human free will. In 1843, Soren Kierkegaard published his philosophical study of the episode Fear and Trembling, in which he portrays Abraham as a knight of faith who has to renounce for God's sake not only his son, but his ethical ideals. Most Jewish and Christian moral theologians reject this view, implying an unacceptable conflict between God's will and ethical ideals, though others would agree that the episode is a warning that religion does not necessarily reflect naturalistic ethics. From the viewpoint of a historian, the tale makes perfect sense, because Abraham, as we know from contemporary archives, came from a legal background where it was mandatory to seal a contract or covenant with an animal sacrifice. The covenant with God was of such transcendent enormity that it demanded something more, a sacrifice of a best loved in the fullest sense, though the subject of the sacrifice was a human being. It was made abortive, thereby remaining valid but formal and ritualistic rather than actual. Isaac was chosen as the offering, not only because he was Abraham's most precious possession, but because he was a special gift of God's under the covenant, and remained God's like all the rest of his gifts to man. This underlines the whole purpose of sacrifice, a symbolic reminder that everything man possesses comes from God and is returnable to him. That is why Abraham called the place of his act of supreme obedience and abortive sacrifice the Mount of the Lord, an adumbration of Sinai and a greater contract. It is significant of the importance of the event that for the first time the Bible narratives introduce the note of universalism into God's promises. He not only undertakes to multiply Abraham's offspring, but now also adds, "And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." We are now close to the notion of an elect nation. The Old Testament, it is important to grasp, is not primarily about justice as an abstract concept. It is about God's justice, which manifests itself by God's acts of choice. In Genesis, we have various examples of the just man, even the only just man in the story of Noah and the flood, in the story of the destruction of Sodom, for example. Abraham is a just man, too, but there is no suggestion that God chose him because he was the only one, or in any sense because of his merits. The Bible is not a work of reason. It is a work of history, dealing with what are to us mysterious and even inexplicable events. It is concerned with the momentous choices which it pleased God to make. It is essential to the understanding of Jewish history to grasp the importance the Jews have always attached to God's unrestricted ownership of creation. Many Jewish beliefs are designed to dramatize this central fact. The notion of an elect people was part of God's purpose to stress his possession of all created things. Abraham was a crucial figure in this demonstration. The Jewish sages taught, 5 possessions has the Holy One, blessed be he, made especially his own. These are the Torah, heaven and earth, Abraham, Israel, and the holy sanctuary. The sages believed that God gave generously of his creation, but retained, as it were, the freehold of everything and a special possessive relationship with selected elements. Thus we find the Holy One, blessed be he, created days and took to himself the Sabbath. He created the months and took to himself the festivals. He created the years and chose for himself the sabbatical year. He created the sabbatical years and chose for himself the Jubilee year. He created the nations and chose for himself Israel. He created the lands and took to himself the land of Israel as a heave offering from all the other lands. As it is written, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. The election of Abraham and his descendants for a special role in God's providence and the donation of the land are inseparable in the biblical presentation of history. Moreover, both gifts are leasehold, not freehold. The Jews are chosen. The land is theirs by grace and favor, always revocable. Abraham is both a real example and a perpetual symbol of a certain fragility and anxiety in Jewish possession. He is a stranger and sojourner, and remains one even after God's election, even after he has elaborately purchased the cave of Machpelah. This uncertainty of ownership is transferred to all his descendants, as the Bible repeatedly reminds us. Thus God tells the Israelites, "And the land is not to be sold in perpetuity, for all land is mine, because you are strangers and sojourners before me." Or again, the people confess, "For we are strangers before you, and sojourners like all our forefathers." And Psalms have David the king say, "I am a stranger with thee, and sojourner, as all my fathers were." All the same, the promise of the land to Abraham is very specific, and it comes in the oldest stratum of the Bible. "To your descendants I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Canaanites and Kenizzites and Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." There is some confusion about the frontiers, since in a later passage God promises only a portion of the larger gift. "And I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan." On the other hand, this latter gift is to be a perpetual possession. The implication here, and in later passages, is that the election of Israel can never be revoked, though it can be suspended by human disobedience. As the Lord's promise is irrevocable, the land will ultimately revert to Israel, even if she loses it for a time. The notion of the promised land is peculiar to Israelite religion, and for the Israelites and the Jews later, it was the most important single element in it. It is significant that the Jews made the 5 early books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, into the core of their Torah or belief, because they dealt with the law, the promise of the land, and its fulfillment. The later books, despite all their brilliance and comprehensibility, never acquired the same central significance. They are not so much revelation as a commentary upon it, dominated by the theme of a promise fulfilled. It is the land that matters most. If Abraham established these fundamentals, it was left to his grandson Jacob to bring into existence a distinct people, Israel, his name and the race being inexorably linked. There has always been a problem of what to term the ancestors of the Jews. Hebrews is unsatisfactory, though it is often necessary to use it, for the term Hebrew, from which it presumably derives, describes more a way of life than a specific racial group. Moreover, it was pejorative. Hebrew does indeed occur in the Pentateuch, meaning the children of Israel, but only when used by the Egyptians or by the Israelites themselves in the presence of Egyptians. From about the 2nd century BC, when it was so used by Ben Sirah, Hebrew was applied to the language of the Bible, and to all subsequent works written in this language. As such, it gradually lost its pejorative overtone, so that both to Jews themselves and to sympathetic Gentiles, it sometimes seemed preferable to Jew as a racial term. In the 19th century, for example, it was much used by the Reform movement in the United States, so that we get such institutions as the Hebrew Union College and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. But the ancestors of the Jews never by choice called themselves Hebrews. When they became conscious of a national identity, the term they used normative in the Bible is Israelites, or children of Israel. And it is this which gives Jacob his main significance. Yet, it is curious and characteristic of the difficulties which have always surrounded Jewish identity and nomenclature that the first mention of the term, when Jacob was divinely renamed Israel, the moment when the nation was born, as it were, occurs in what is perhaps the most mysterious and obscure passage in the entire Bible, Jacob's night-long struggle with the angel. The term Israel may mean he who fights gods, he who fights for God, he whom God fights, or whom God rules, the upright of God, or God is upright. There is no agreement, nor has anyone yet provided a satisfactory account of what the incident means. It is evident that the earliest editors and transcribers of the Bible did not understand it either, but they recognized it as an important moment in the history and, far from adapting it to suit their religious understanding, reproduced it verbatim because it was Torah and sacred. The career of Jacob is described at great length in Genesis, and was indeed remarkable. He was quite unlike his grandfather, Abraham, a dissimulator, a Machiavellian, a strategist rather than a fighter, a politician, an operator, as well as a dreamer and visionary. Jacob prospered mightily and became a much more substantial man than Abraham or his father Isaac. He eventually had himself laid to rest beside the tombs of his forebears, but in the meantime he set up columns or built altars over a wide range of territory. He is described as still a stranger in Canaan, like his father. Indeed, all his sons, except the last, Benjamin, seem to have been born in Mesopotamia or Syria, but it is during his lifetime that these links with the east and north were finally severed, and his followers began to think of themselves as linked in some permanent way to Canaan, so that even if they go to Egypt in time of famine, the divine dispensation is that they will return inexorably.